So I guess I want to talk about something a little bit more in depth, I suppose, when compared to other things that I've talked about previously. Today I want to talk about death. I feel like death is something that is in our lives or is present in our lives in some way, whether that be an actual death of a close one that you know of, or perhaps you haven't ever experienced any sort of events like that. So maybe, death in and of itself is in our lives in some way. We all fear death, and death is something that everybody has to worry about at some point in their lives. We're not going to be living forever. So since death is something so I guess popular, or at least talked about, or maybe it isn't talked about. I don't know. I don't really talk about death much. And you know why I don't talk about death? Because you can't really define something like death easily. I have various ideas of what death might be, but overall, you couldn't really. If you were to ask me what death is, it'd take me some time to figure out an answer. I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know what biological processes define what death is in terms of a scientist's view. But for the most part, most people aren't going to really know what death is in general. So to get started, I suppose what death is to me initially is just a sort of end to my life. It acts as a sort of end to my life, a little something to cap it all off. But I don't really know what happens when you die. I guess I also think that before even dying in the first place, you're going to feel a lot of pain before the whole process happens. So I guess what defines death is really the pain that precedes it, and also just the fact that it's the ending. You will not experience anything more after it. But then, a counter argument to that claim could be that, hey, let's say somebody's in a coma or something. Now, I'm not smart enough to figure out what actually goes on in a coma. I don't have that knowledge. But for the sake of the argument, let's just say, hey, maybe you're not in a coma, maybe you're sleeping, maybe you're just unconscious in some fashion. And what that does is that allows us to see what happens when we compare the two situations. Okay, somebody's dying, and usually what precedes death is, well, your cease of consciousness at some time point for some interval. So in this case, if we have somebody who's just sleeping or maybe in a coma, they're not gonna be dead after sleeping. But let's say this person who's sleeping suddenly dies whilst they're sleeping. Maybe they have a heart attack or something like that. In that case, that would constitute what death really means. And really, that person's dying the moment they go asleep. But I would think that is the case. I feel like if somebody's going to go to sleep and then die afterwards, they're dying at a different time point than when they're just going to sleep. If they're totally healthy when they're going to sleep, then that certainly doesn't mean they're actually in the process of dying. So then, what exactly defines dying in that case? Since if that person isn't dying, but they're going unconscious for a certain amount of time, they don't have the pain that I talked about before. So then, all in all, what defines death is a certain amount of pain that you have to feel. But how much pain? Is it just a little bit of pain? And isn't there people that can die in their sleep? Because even if I were to put an extra property on death, on the process of death, being that, hey, you have to feel some pain before you are actually considered to be dying, then maybe death isn't something that needs any sort of pain, because there are people out there that can die during their sleep, or perhaps maybe even without any sort of pain to feel in the first place. So there isn't really an easy way of defining what death is or the process of death. But I feel like what I've done here is made the mistake of not defining the correct thing. What I'm trying to define right now is a process of death, but what I really wanted to know what death exactly is. The process before which you die, I don't really care about. That's something that other people can worry about. But what exactly is death? What defines death? I suppose an easy answer to that would be the end of life without any pain, because I guess the pain part of it is something to do with the process of death, and that sort of has a biological understanding behind it. But the actual thought of dying and ending your life should be defined by only one thing, and that is the cease of consciousness. But again, when you take somebody who's sleeping, they're not actually dying for that moment that they're unconscious. So then, in that case, is it really death when they're sleeping? No, it isn't. They're just sleeping. So it can't just be the cease of unconscious and the cease of any sort of thought. Plus, you're also dreaming, so how would that be equivalent to some sort of death? So I suppose death could be categorized by, yeah, you're unconscious, but you never wake up. But then in that case, let's take a situation in which somebody else is sleeping, so they're unconscious, but they're alive at that point, and then I shoot them or I cut off their head. In that case, they're dead after I cut off their head. And let's also assume for this situation they feel no pain whatsoever. I mean, in that case, are they dead at the start of their sleep because they're unconscious at that time and they never wake back up? And let's also assume for this situation they don't wake up, that this is an instantaneous chopping of the head or instantaneous death at the hands of myself. Then what exactly defines the period in which they're dead? Is it when I chop their head off? Is it when something comes into contact with their neck? Or maybe, let's take a situation in which I inject them with something in their sleep. Or let's inject them with something before they sleep so they stay really, they don't wake up at all. And if they don't wake up at all, let's put some strong anesthetic in there. So that if they'll never wake up, I can just, maybe they're in a surgery and I screw something up and I kill them in the process, but they never wake up. So then what exactly defines their death in that case? Is it the fact that I'm there? But I mean, looking at it in the eyes of the other person, they're just going to sleep. They're going to fall asleep and they're not going to know if they're going to wake up afterwards. And so how would they know that they're dying? Do they need to know that they're dying? And that leads me to another question. Does a person itself, the person, the victim that's actually dying as a result of some other some other object in their world, do they need to know that they're dying for them to be dead? Because most people die and they don't, well, I guess in the situation I was describing before, the victim doesn't know that they're actually gonna die. They don't have knowledge of that fact. As such, the only people who actually can define somebody as dead is the people that are observing that person outside of the world. The other individual who's actually in the process of dying won't really know that they're dead in the situations that I was describing before. So in that case, what defines death isn't exactly your level of consciousness. It's whatever somebody else thinks. Because how can I define myself as dead when the only time when I'm actually dead and when I have knowledge of my death is after I've died? Because I don't know, I've never died before. How could I know what death feels like if I've never experienced it before? Or does somebody have to experience? Nobody knows what death is, because death is defined in and of itself as the end of somebody's life, as the end of consciousness, as the end of thought and any sort of analytical thinking or memory. As such, nobody would remember what death feels like. Maybe you could remember what dying feels like, but death in itself isn't something that can be known by man. As such, does death really even exist? Can I even die? If I fall off a cliff and jump to my death per se, does death even exist? Can I even die in that case? Well, all the people that have been able to do that and that have been alive for such a thing, well, they haven't died. The only people that have knowledge of whether or not you die from jumping off of a cliff is if they survived it somehow. And all the people that have actually died, they can't tell you whether or not they've died. Maybe they've gone to another, maybe they've been reborn. If somebody's been reborn after dying, then are they actually dead? Because they're still living a continuation of their own lives just in a separate body. In that case, that individual who's been reborn still, let's say, has their memories intact. So their sense of self is still there, but they're in a different body. And they've thought they might have died, but how do they know? Overall, after thinking about these many situations, I think the answer to this question is just that death doesn't have any definition. Because the concept of death, the only thing that defines it, is the cease of any knowledge, of any thought, of any consciousness to even define what death is. In that case, death doesn't exist. But that seems kind of dumb to think. When you think about the person falling off of the edge of a cliff, they're still dying, aren't they? Because nobody's going to do that. Nobody in their right mind would want to jump off of a cliff. And I feel like the answer to that question, what exactly is death and why we fear jumping off of a cliff, why we fear death so much, it's just that we fear the concept of dying and the pain that is resulted by the act of death, and the pain of losing our memories, of the chance that we're going to lose our memories. But we don't actually know for sure whether or not we're going to lose our memories in such a case. So honestly, death, I don't think, actually has a definition. It's a concept that you can't really define, because there isn't any physical or experience that can define it, that anybody's would know about. That's because it's dying that we're really truly fearful of. It's the fear that the fear of death is simply the fear of us having our last moments. But we're not actually fearful of the fact that we're going to have no life. Because once you have no life, there isn't anything to be sad about. There isn't any way you can be sad because you have no thoughts, you have no conscience. But the moments before death are what actually we're scared of. It's the fact that when I fall off a cliff, I'm going to be thinking to myself, oh man, I'm going to die. And every person that I've ever known, and every situation that I may be in the future or have been in the past is going to be gone, and I'm not going to be able to reminisce on those experiences. And that is what I think death is.